Today, we're going to add opacity controls to our particle system. Let's go! Alright, for the past 2 months, all of my videos have been focused on building a particle system from scratch in Shader Graph or in Unreal's Material Editor. We've made some great progress so far, and you can see some examples of what the system can do here. We just have a few more features to add. If you haven't seen the other videos in this series yet, I'll link the playlist down in the description so you can catch up. Alright, so last week we added flipbook animated textures to our particles. So now they look a lot more realistic. Previously they were just colored squares, but now they actually look like water and smoke. But there's still a major problem with what we have now. Can you see here how the particles are popping in and popping out when they spawn and when they die? So today we're going to solve that problem. You can see down here at the bottom, the particles just go pop, pop, pop when they come in. And then up here at the top, there's no fade in and fade out. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to add controls for controlling the overall opacity of the particles, and also for fading them in when they spawn and fading them out when they die. All right, let's jump right into the shader and get going. Okay, so here's the whole shader that we've built so far. And right now we're in Unity, obviously, but in a few minutes I'll switch over to Unreal and show you how to do the same thing there. So we have controls over the rotation of the particles, controlling the lifetime of the particles, making the particles face the camera, controlling the direction and speed of the particles. We added wind and gravity and offset the particles' position. We created random values for the particles, and down here, this is the part that creates the flipbook textures. And today we're going to add opacity. So the first thing that we need to do is open up our blackboard, and we're just going to go ahead and add some new controls here. So the first one that I'm going to add is a float, and it's just simply called opacity. And then the next one I'm going to create is called fade in power. And then the final one is called fade out power. And let's add some default values here. So I'll open up the graph inspector. So we'll select opacity, and I'm going to set a value of 4 for opacity, a value of 0.5 for our fade in power, and for our fade out power, I'm going to default it to a value of 2. All right, we're ready to start building our graph. And so what I'm going to do here is start out with the value that represents the lifetime of our particle. And that lifetime is a linear value that goes from 0 to 1 and then repeats over and over. And so I'm going to drag this value down, and we're going to use the power node here. I'm going to raise the power of the lifetime of our particles using fade in power. So this fade in power value controls the curve of the particles when they are first born. So the higher this value is, the smoother that curve will be. It's kind of like a slow in curve. And so that will allow us to fade in. So that the higher this value is, the more fade in we'll get. All right, now I'm going to do the same thing again. I'm going to drag the particle's lifetime down, but this time I'm going to add a 1 minus. And what this is going to do is invert that lifetime curve and allow us to do the same thing with our fade out power control. So I'll add another power node, and I'll grab our fade out power value and plug that in here. So now we have our fade in, raising the lifetime to a power, and our fade out, raising the inverted lifetime to a power. And now all I need to do is multiply the results of these two together. So these two little units here allow me to control the curve at the beginning and the curve at the end of the particle's lifetime. And then I combine them together to get the final curve. And now I also want to use this opacity value to control the overall opacity so that I can make the whole thing more opaque or more transparent. So I just need to take my overall opacity and multiply it with the results that I already have. And then I want to make sure that the opacity that I'm calculating here doesn't go above 0 or below 1. So I can just add a saturate node here at the end. And that's it. I've added all of the controls for opacity. Now I want to do as much math as possible in the Vertex shader to save on performance. And last week when we generated our flipbook coordinates, we used a custom interpolator here to ensure that our flipbook coordinates were being calculated in the Vertex shader rather than the pixel shader. And so I'm going to do the same thing with opacity. Here we're calculating our flipbook coordinates and passing them to this combine node here, and then passing them out to our custom interpolator, which we decided to call particle data. So you can see that our flipbook coordinates are only using the first 2 out of 4 components that we have available. And so for opacity, I'm going to pass that into this last component, which is the alpha channel. That's kind of fitting that we're using the alpha channel for opacity. Let's go ahead and pass out this opacity value that we created into the alpha channel of our combine node here, which then goes to our particle data so that I can get interpolated from the Vertex shader to the pixel shader. Oh, and one other thing, I'm just going to grab these nodes here and group them together. And we'll just label this opacity. All right, the last thing that we need to do, so here our opacity is going out of the Vertex shader, and here we have our custom interpolator node that's bringing in that data to the pixel shader. So I have my split node here, and I can find this value that's going into our alpha channel into the Vertex shader. It's coming out in the pixel shader here in the alpha channel. So the last thing that I need to do is just make sure that that opacity is getting used in the pixel shader by grabbing my texture sample here, and I have an alpha channel here, and I just need to multiply my textures alpha channel. There you can see it animated. And you just need to multiply my textures alpha channel by the opacity that I'm calculating, and then pass that to the alpha in my pixel shader. All right, and I don't like these previews that are 3D, and so I'm just going to go ahead and set my preview to be 2D instead, just so it's a little bit more clear what's happening. Okay, we've added our opacity controls. Let's go ahead and save our shader, and we'll switch over to our scene and take a look at how we can use these controls to improve our results. Okay, now we can take a look at our sample particle systems. You can see over here on the left, we've got our waterfall. And here I have the controls opened up, and you can see that I have these new opacity controls, opacity, fade in power, and fade out power that we just added. So opacity is currently set to 2. If I set it to 1, now you can see that the particles are more transparent. And the lower that I go on this value, like if I go to 0, it's obviously going to be completely transparent. But if I go to 0.5 or maybe 0.2, you can see I'm making the waterfall even more subtle. So I think a value of 0.2 was working pretty well. Now you can also see I've got the fade in and fade out power controls here. And here at the top of the waterfall, instead of popping in, the particles are fading in really nicely. If I set this value to 0 again, now you can see the particles are popping in. But as I set this value higher, they fade in even more. So let's set this to something like 2. Now you can see that it's really subtle where they're fading in for quite a bit of the lifetime. So maybe we want to keep this at 0.5. But overall, the fade in and fade out controls that we've added have removed that popping, and we're no longer having the particles pop when they spawn in and spawn out. Let's take a look at our smoke here. If you'll remember previously, when our particles died, at the end of their life, they were just popping out, and we can control that here if we set the fade out power to 0. This is what it used to look like, with the smoke just kind of unnaturally immediately ceasing to exist. So let's set this to something like 2, and you can see now the smoke will slowly fade out and dissipate as its lifetime continues. You can see we're still getting a little bit of popping down here in the bottom. That may be okay, but we can fix that if we set our fade in power to something just a little bit higher, maybe 0.5. Now they fade in a little bit slower, and it's a little bit less jarring when those particles appear. All right, let's take a look at our fountain over here. Previously, when the particles died, they were popping out, just like we saw with the other particle systems, but now you can see this water, as it gets to its apex and begins to fall back down, it kind of really nice and smoothly dissipates, whereas before it was popping something like this. So this feels a lot more unnatural, but as we set our fade out power to 2, now we get something that feels a lot nicer. And now we've got our mist over here on the right side, and our mist is significantly improved from what it used to be. It used to just be like these big solid particles, and now it's feeling a lot more misty because we're able to hide the fact or hide the pop in and pop out of the particles. And so unless you watch these things really carefully, you can't really see where one particle dies and another spawns. It just feels like this mist that's continuing to exist and sort of drift along. So really nice. We've been able to add the fade in, fade out, and overall opacity values. Oh, and with our mist, our opacity value is set to 1 right now. If we set this really high, again, you can see we can control just kind of the overall, like how solid that material is. If I set it to 1, it looks nice and misty, and I can go like even more subtle if we go down to like 0.3, for example. If we go up to a value of 4, now our mist is a lot more thick. I think we'll stick with a value of 1. That looks pretty good. Okay, we're making great progress. The next thing that we're going to add next week is we're going to add color to our particles. Right now, we're just using the black and white textures as color, but we can also tint these things, and so that's what we're going to do. It's going to make our water effects look a little bit more like water, and we'll be able to make our smoke go from like a light color to a dark color over the lifetime, as an example. All right, so I hope you tune in next week for that. And in the meantime, let's switch over to Unreal, and I'll show you how to add these opacity controls in there as well. All right, here we are in Unreal, and you can see that we have the same particle systems that we've been creating in Unity here, and we've also got the same problem. Last week we added our flipbook textures, and so these particle systems are looking significantly more realistic, except for the popping artifact. And it's especially visible if we take a look at our chimney smoke here, especially right here at the end where the particles die. You can see that they just pop right out, and that looks really unrealistic because this kind of material, in reality, it just dissipates. It doesn't instantly disappear like what we're seeing here. So we're going to add some controls to our particle system that allow us to control the overall opacity of the particles and also the fade in and fade out of the particles. You know, over here on the mist, you can see this mist is significantly more opaque than it should be. So we're going to add a value that we can change to control the opacity as well as the fade in and fade out. All right, let's switch to our shader. And here we are. So this is the shader that we've been building for the last month or two, I suppose. And we've got all kinds of controls here for controlling the rotation of the particles, the direction and speed of the particles, making the particles face the camera and as billboards, controlling the position and the offset of the particles, adding wind and gravity so they can be acted on by the forces in the world. And over here, we're generating some random values that allow us to make each particle behave uniquely from the others. And then last week, we added our flipbook controls here that allow the particles to have these really nice looking animated textures like you see over here. All right, so we're going to add opacity to our particle system now. And in order to do that, we need to create 3 parameters. So I'm just going to add a scalar parameter, and we're going to call this first one opacity. And we'll give it a default value of 4. And let's just copy that one. And this one we're going to call fade in power. And we'll give fade in power a default value of 0.5. And we'll copy it again. We're going to call this one fade out power. And we'll give fade out power a default value of 2. The reason we have these default values is for fade in power, we want the particles to appear fairly quickly, but then for fade out power, we want them to fade out more slowly. So the higher, for both of these, the higher the value, the more slowly that's going to take, or the more of the lifetime it's going to spend fading. And the lower this is, the more popping you're going to get. So if we set either of these values to 0, you'll get a particle that pops in. But the higher the number, the longer that fade is going to take to happen. All right, so we need to come up here and find our lifetime value. Here it is. This value here in our lifetime section is controlling the length of time the particles live. And that's a linear value that progresses from 0 to 1 and then loops back around 0 to 1. And that's what that frac node is doing there. So I'm going to grab that value and drag it down here. And we're going to raise that value to a power using our fade in power parameter. So I'm just going to connect this up, fade in power. And we're going to do the same thing with our fade out power parameter. I'm going to grab our lifetime and bring it down here. And we're going to add a power node and raise our lifetime to the fade out power. Oh, I forgot one thing actually. We need to add a 1 minus. So we're going to invert the lifetime for the fade out power. So I'm going to grab this value here and plug it into the 1 minus instead, and then plug that into power. Then we're going to take our fade out power parameter and plug it in to our power node. All right, let me just kind of clean things up here just a little bit. Okay, there we go. So we have our fade in power and we have our fade out power. And now we just need to combine the two of these together. So I'm going to add a multiply. And we'll multiply our fade in and fade out power together. And then finally, we need to bring in the idea of the overall opacity. So to do that, I can just multiply the overall opacity in. And we'll take the results of everything and add a saturate node here at the end to make sure that our value doesn't go below 0 or above 1. All right, so these are the controls that we need to control the opacity of our particles. And now we want to make sure that this math is being done in the Vertex shader instead of the pixel shader so that we can save on some performance. Doing things in the Vertex shader is a lot faster than doing them in the pixel shader for every pixel. And so what I'm going to do is drag out here and add a Vertex Interpolator node. And that will ensure that the math that we're doing here is happening in the Vertex shader instead of the pixel shader. All right, so we've got our opacity here. And now we need to take our opacity value here and multiply it with the alpha channel that's coming from our texture. So this is the opacity that's coming from our texture, and it's going into the opacity on our root node there. Before that happens, though, we need to multiply in the opacity that we just calculated. So we'll grab the output of our Vertex Interpolator, connect that to this multiply here, and then bring that up and put that into our opacity output. All right, so now we have three controls here: fade in power, fade out power, and opacity. And we can use these controls to control the overall opacity of the particle system and how much it's fading in and fading out. All right, I'm just gonna take these and we're gonna group them together, and I'll call this opacity. And then the last thing that we can do is select these, and I'm gonna assign some groups to them so they'll look nice in our material instance. So the group I'm gonna call opacity, and the sort priority for this one, I'm gonna give it a 0. And then for our fade in power, I'm gonna put that in our opacity group and give it a value of 1. And then for our fade out power, again, I'm gonna put this in the opacity group and give it a value of 2. So now when these parameters show up in our material instance, they will be nicely grouped into the opacity group, and they'll be in order: first opacity, then fade in power, then fade out power. And I'm gonna show you that right now. So let's go ahead and save our particle system, and we'll switch over to our scene, and let's pull up our material instances so we can actually get a look at what those values look like. All right, here we are in our scene, and you can see that we've got our 4 particle effects here. And let's go ahead and set their material instance values. So over here for our waterfall, here's our material instance for the waterfall. And I can turn on the opacity, and I can control the overall opacity of the particle effects here. So if I set this to 0, you know, obviously our particles are going to be completely transparent. They're still there. If I select them, you can see the outline. They're just like 100% transparent. So we can control their overall opacity with this value. And I'm just going to go ahead and set that to 2. And for fade in power, I think the default of 0.5 is a good value there. You can see that with a value of 0.5, instead of popping, the particles are doing some nice fade in at the top here. If we set this to 0, maybe that's a little bit too harsh and the particles pop. But with the default value of 0.5, that works pretty well. And then for our fade out value, I think the default of 2 works pretty well as well. But actually, I think I'm going to set this to 0.8 to have a little bit harder edge down here where the particle's lifetime ends. All right, with our smoke, fade in and fade out make a really big difference for our smoke. Before, we were seeing the smoke particles just really popping a lot as they got to the end of their lifetime. But now that we have this fade out power value here set to 2, you can see that as the smoke particles get higher, they just slowly drift off and dissipate to nothing instead of popping. If we set this value to 0, like we had before, now the particles are popping out, and that's not good. So let's just leave this at the default 2 value, and we should be good to go. We can also control the smoke's overall opacity. If I set this to something really high, like 12, now you can see that we have more opacity, obviously. And if I set this to something really low, like 0.2, now our smoke is extremely subtle. So maybe we want to stick with our nice default value of 0.4 there. Okay, here is our fountain. We'll just come on over here. And for the fountain, we mostly want these particles to be nice and opaque. So I'm just going to set their opacity to a value of 12. And then for the fade in power, we're going to leave that at 0.5. And the fade out power, we'll leave that at 2. But you can see that here at the end of the particle's lifetimes, they're doing this really nice fade out. They're no longer kind of popping out at the end. All right, let's come over here to our mist. This is the one where our opacity value is going to make a really big difference. For our mist, right now, it's really, really opaque, and we want it to be a lot more subtle. And so I'm just going to select opacity here, and let's set the mist opacity to a value of 1 instead. Okay, that is really nice. Now it's not just kind of in your face opaque, but there's some nice subtlety to the opacity. And for the fade in and fade out power, we want these both, we want the particles to like slowly fade in and then slowly fade out. If you watch our mist here for a minute, when a particle first comes in, it comes in a little bit abruptly. I don't know if it's going to oblige and show it to me. The mist particle's lifetimes is fairly long. No, I'm not really seeing it, but we can set our fade in power to 1 and our fade out power to 1 so that both of these happen smoothly, and it'll make it so that the mist never shows you when a particle fades in and fades out. It's subtle enough when it fades in and subtle enough when it fades out that it's just going to look like the mist is drifting and not fading in or fading out at all. And that's the effect that we're going for. All right, let's back off here a little bit. I'm going to save these material instances and shut them down. And we'll just take a look here at our overall scene. All right, we've got some really nice looking particle effects now. Whereas before we just had these random colored cubes, now we have what actually looks like real physical phenomenon that are happening in our scene. And that's just super cool. All right, so next week we're going to take a look at adding color to our particles. We're going to add a begin color and an end color so that we can control what color our particles are when they spawn in and when they die. All right, well, that's our video for this week. I hope you enjoyed it and that you're able to kind of follow along and create this particle system and that you're having fun with this. That's the important part. All right, thanks for watching, everybody, and we'll see you next week.